the name, what we're looking for here. What operation is difference? Very good. So, what we're looking for here needs to have subtraction in it, since that's what difference means. And a square is going to be something that has a perfect square root. So like, for example, the square root of 9 is 3, right? It comes out nice and even. But is there a square root of 7? It's not going to come out with a nice and neat number. So the problems we're looking at today have to have subtraction in them, and they have to be numbers or terms that have a perfect square root. But before we actually factor any, they ask us to FOIL these two and get the product. So that just means multiply it all out, right? So I would multiply everything in the first parenthesis by everything in the second. So first I would multiply x times x, which is going to give me... Oh, sorry. Okay, so then we multiply x times negative 2, which is going to give us negative 2x. And then we have to multiply the 2 to the second parenthesis. So 2 times x will give us, good, and then 2 times negative 2. There we go. And so this is what we get when we FOIL it all out. Is there any like terms that I can combine here? Right, the negative 2x and positive 2x. If I add those together, what do I get? 0. They just basically go away. So I end up with x squared minus 4. Okay. All right, let's FOIL out number 2 as well. So I have 6x times 6x. No. Oh, 36. So 36x squared. And then 6x times negative 1. Good. And then 1 times 6x. And then 1 times negative 1. Again, we've got some like terms to combine, right? And negative 6x plus 6x, again, gives me 0. So we really just have 36x squared minus 1. Okay, so when I ask you to factor a difference of squares, we said it had to have two things, right? It had to have subtraction. Both of these have subtraction. And the terms in it have to have a perfect square root. The square root of x squared is x. Square root of 4 is 2. Square root of 36x squared is 6x. The square root of 1 is 1. So all of these would have nice and neat square roots. So when I ask you to factor a difference of squares, I'm going to give you a problem like one of these. This is what you'll be given. And if you remember, back when we first started factoring, we had some fill-in-the-blank notes. And we said that factoring was the opposite of multiplication. So if I ask you to factor this, I should be going back to the 2 parentheses, right? I'm working backwards from what we just did. Same thing here. If we factor this, we're going back to the parentheses. We're undoing the multiplication. Also, do you guys notice anything about these 2 parentheses that we started with on number 1? Right, they're exactly the same except for one is positive and one is negative. What about on this one? Exact same thing. So, if this is the problem I'm giving, when I work backwards, not only should I get 2 parentheses, those 2 parentheses should be exactly the same, just one should have a positive and one should have a negative. So when I'm trying to think of what numbers go in my parentheses, they got to be the same in both parentheses. All right? So now that we know what our answers should look like, let's try factoring some. So on number 1, first thing we should always do is look for a GCF. Is there a GCF on number 1? So no term to pull out, so I'm going to go ahead and make my parenthesis. All right, and the first term always comes from the first term in the problem, right? So what would multiply to give me x squared? I'm going to put x and x. Previously, we've always had 3 terms. The middle term was the one that had just one variable with it, right? And then the last term was our product. So middle term was sum, last term is product. This one doesn't have a middle term, right? there is no sum, or my sum must be 0 if it's not there. And then my product for this one would be negative 36. So remember, if we just have x and x here, my rule is I'm looking for something that will multiply to give me my product, but will add to give me my sum. So what multiplies to give me negative 36 and adds to give me 0? Right, 6 and negative 6. So those must be the factors that I put in my parentheses. A positive 6 and a negative 6. And we said that our two parentheses should be identical, just one with a positive and one with a negative, which is exactly what we got here. Okay? Okay, let's actually do number 3 before we do 2. So, looking at this one right here, is there a GCF on number 3? No, nothing that they have in common. So I'm going to go ahead and split this into 2 parentheses. And remember, whatever I put here comes from my first term, right? Right, it's got to be 7 and 7 because we have to put the same number. So 7 here and 7 here. Okay? Then my last term comes from here. Got to be the same number. What multiplies to give me 4? 2 and 2. So it must be 2x and 2x. And we know that one of them has to be positive and one has to be negative. So there's not as much guess and check on this one because you know it has to be ones that are the same number when you're deciding what to put in there. Okay, now we can do number 2. On number 2, is there a GCF? No. So we go ahead and we make our 2 parentheses. What am I going to put at the front of them? All right. Again, this one's similar to number 1, right? There is no sum in the middle. We know it must be 0, and we had a lead coefficient of 1. So right now, I'm trying to think, what will add up to 0 and multiply to give me positive 25? Okay, so 5 and negative 5. That would give me 0 if I add it. But will 5 times negative 5 give me a positive 25? Is there anything else we can think of that would make that happen? It's not possible to do both, right? If it multiplies to give me a positive, it's not going to add to give me 0, or vice versa. So, this does not factor. Looking at this problem, what's different about this one than the 2 that we did previously? It has a plus sign in the middle. And we said that difference of squares had to have subtraction. So, this is not a difference of squares. If you ever have 2 terms like this and you're supposed to be factoring, there's a plus sign in the middle, it's not going to factor. So anytime you got that plus sign, it does not factor. Okay, last one, number 4, do we have a GCF there? And what can I pull out of 16 and 100? Good. So I'm going to pull out that GCF of 4. So what is 16y squared divided by 4? Good. And negative 100 divided by 4? 25. Good. Okay. So now we can factor it. Don't forget to put that GCF out in front. Okay, so whatever I put here and here has to give me 4y squared, and it's got to be the same number. So what would it be? 2y. Good. And whatever I put at the end has to be the same number and give me 25. Right. 1 positive and 1 negative. All right. Okay. So should look for a GCF first, because that made this to be numbers that we could find easy square roots of. So always look for that GCF first. And if it has a plus sign, we know it does not factor.